It began in a town where nothing ever seemed to change. The streets were lined with crooked telephone poles and sagging porches, and in summer the air grew so thick with heat it felt like you could drink it. People here knew each other's names, their families, their secrets. They waved at one another in the grocery store, shared coffee in the diner that had been there for 50 years, and told themselves that bad things only happened far away, in bigger, colder cities. But in truth, this town was no safer than anywhere else. It just hadn't been tested yet. That night, the moon hung low over the rooftops, heavy and pale, throwing long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. The houses sat quietly, their windows glowing faintly from the light inside, each one holding its own story. Some were peaceful, others were not. At the very edge of town, beyond the last streetlight, there stood a weathered farmhouse with peeling white paint and a yard gone to weeds. Most people passed it without looking. The ones who knew its history avoided it altogether. Inside that house, a family lived a life that seemed ordinary from the outside. The father was a tall, broad man with a deep voice and a way of speaking that made people listen, whether they wanted to or not. His wife was quieter, her presence softer, but her eyes held something restless, as if she was always looking past you at something you couldn't see. They had 3 children, bright, well-behaved, the kind who smiled for neighbors and said thank you without being told. The firstborn, a boy, had just turned 12. That life here wasn't without its tensions, though most of them went unspoken. The father ran the household like it was his own small kingdom. Rules were clear, voices were low, and what happened inside these walls stayed here. The mother moved carefully around him, her kindness deliberate, but her silences even more so. The boy had learned early how to read the room, how to sense the shift in the air before a storm of words or anger began. The younger children still had the innocence to believe everything was fine. The town itself had its own unspoken rules. There were families you respected, families you pitied, and families you stayed away from. Some people whispered about the father's business dealings, the way he always seemed to come out ahead, the way no one dared to cross him. Others said he was just a man who worked hard for what he had. But there was one thing no one questioned. He always got what he wanted, and no one, not even his children, could say otherwise. On that particular night, the air carried a stillness that didn't feel right. It was late summer, but the wind had a sharpness to it, like it was warning of a change no one could stop. The family sat in the living room, the television murmuring in the background, though no one was watching. The boy sat apart from the others, staring at something only he could see. His mother glanced at him now and then, her brow tightening just enough to show she noticed. His father barely looked his way. Outside, the sky darkened faster than usual, the horizon swallowing the last trace of daylight. A few houses away, an old woman sat by her window, watching the farmhouse. She'd lived in this town her whole life, long enough to know when something was about to happen. She couldn't say why she felt it, just that she did. And she knew, in the pit of her stomach, that whatever was coming would start there, in that house, with that boy. People would later remember small things. The boy had been quieter than usual at school. How the mother had been seen at the grocery store, staring too long at the shelves before walking out without buying anything. How the father had seemed distracted, more tense than usual, his voice clipped, his eyes cold. None of it had seemed important at the time. But looking back, it was clear these were the cracks. And cracks, no matter how small, always spread. The firstborn had always felt the weight of something he couldn't name. He'd heard things in the dark, whispers that didn't belong to anyone in the house. He'd dreamed of shadows that stood at the foot of his bed, watching, waiting. But lately, the dreams had changed. They felt closer, more real. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were telling him things, warning him, promising him. That night, the wind outside rose, rattling the loose shutters and bending the tall grass in the yard. The boy's MOT. Her flinched at the sound, glancing at the front door as if expecting someone to knock. The father leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, pretending not to notice. The younger children were already upstairs, tucked into bed. The boy stayed where he was, still and pale, as if he knew the night would not end the way it began in the days that followed. People would struggle to explain what happened next. Some would say it was fate, others would call it curse. But the truth was much darker, buried in years of secrets, power, and a prophecy no one dared to speak out loud. One that would claim every firstborn until it was satisfied. It started with small shifts, the kind most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking for them. The boy's mother began to keep to herself more, spending long hours in the kitchen with the radio turned low, her hands busy, but her mind somewhere else. She'd stopped meeting the neighbors for morning coffee, and when they asked if she was all right, she'd smile too quickly, say she was just tired, and change the subject. Her husband didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and simply didn't care. The father's voice grew sharper in those weeks, his patience thinner. He'd come home later than usual, his shirt smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't hers. Some nights, he wouldn't bother eating dinner, heading straight to his office at the back of the house, where the door stayed closed until well after midnight. He claimed it was work, but the mother knew better. She'd seen the envelopes that came in the mail with no return address, the folded pieces of paper hidden in the inside pocket of his coat. She never opened them, but she could imagine, and imagining hurt more than knowing. The boy noticed, too. He'd always been able to read the air between his parents, to sense when his father's temper was ready to spark. But lately, it wasn't just anger in the house. It was something heavier. He'd catch his father staring at him in a way that made his stomach twist, like he was being measured, weighed against something unseen. He'd hear his mother crying quietly behind her bedroom door, stopping abruptly when she heard footsteps in the hallway one evening. A storm rolled in from the east, low clouds pressing down until the whole town felt darker. The father came home earlier than usual, but his mood was worse. He'd lost a deal, something important enough that he slammed the kitchen drawer so hard it split. The mother didn't argue. She served dinner, kept her head down, and Clea read the plates without a word. But the boy, maybe without meaning to, broke the silence. He asked if everything was all right. The father's gaze snapped to him, cold and sharp. "Mind your business," he said, his voice low enough to make the boy's chest tighten. The boy nodded and looked at his plate, but the damage was done. His father didn't forget moments like that. Days later, whispers began circulating in town. People said the father was in trouble with someone he shouldn't have crossed. Men from outside who didn't forgive debts easily. A neighbor swore she'd seen a black car parked across from the farmhouse late at night, the kind of car you didn't see much around here. Another claimed she heard voices arguing in the yard, though when she looked out, there was no one there. The boy's mother started locking the doors earlier in the evening, checking each window twice before bed. She'd look out toward the edge of the yard, as if expecting something or someone to appear. She didn't tell the children why. She didn't even tell herself. There were other tensions, too, ones that had nothing to do with business or debts. The boy's father had always favored him, though not in a way that felt like love. It was more like ownership, as if the boy was a reflection of him that had to be perfect, controlled. When the boy made mistakes, even small ones, the punishments were swift and deliberate. His younger siblings were spared from this kind of scrutiny, which only deepened the boy's sense of isolation. One night, the boy overheard an argument in his parents' bedroom. The walls were thin, and the voices carried. His mother was begging for something. He didn't know what. His father's voice was steady, almost too calm, but the words cut through the air. You knew what this would cost. We can't stop it now. The boy lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what those words meant. That same week, the boy began having the dreams again, only now they were worse. The shadow at the foot of his bed wasn't standing still anymore. It moved closer each night, its shape twisting, its voice growing clearer. It spoke of an old promise, one made long before the boy was born. It spoke of a debt that could only be paid in blood. The boy would wake in a cold sweat, the sound of his heartbeat loud in his ears. The mother noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way he jumped at small noises, but she didn't press him. She had her nightmares to contend with. Only hers came when she was awake. She'd started remembering things from before the children were born. Times when she'd seen her husband meet with people who seemed to look through her, as if SH. You weren't even there. She recalled one winter night, years ago, when she'd overheard a conversation about a prophecy and firstborn sons. She convinced herself it was nonsense. But now, watching her eldest grow quieter, paler, she wasn't so sure. The pressure in the house kept building. The father's temper became unpredictable. The mother's silences grew longer. The boy felt trapped between them, unable to speak the truth about the shadows, knowing no one would believe him. At school, he stopped talking to his friends, avoiding eye contact with teachers. His grades slipped, and the principal called his parents in for a meeting. The father left, furious, his anger spilling over into slammed doors and long, cold stares. One night, while the younger children slept upstairs, the boy came downstairs for water and found his mother in the kitchen, standing in the dark. She was holding a small box, her fingers trembling. She looked at him like she was about to say something important, something that might have changed everything. But then the sound of the father's footsteps in the hallway froze her. She slipped the box in her apron pocket and told the boy to go back to B.D.B. by the end of that month. The house felt like it was closing in on itself. The boy's dreams had stopped feeling like dreams. The whispers followed him into waking hours, curling around his thoughts, filling the silence with warnings he couldn't ignore. The shadow no longer stayed at the foot of his bed. It stood beside it, breathing softly, waiting in town. People kept their distance from the family. The black car returned more often, staying longer. The father's smile grew tighter when he greeted people in public, his voice a little too pleasant, his eyes just a little too empty. The mother seemed to shrink into herself, her gaze always lowered, her hands busy. The night before everything broke, the boy stood in his room, staring out the window. The yard was empty, but the feeling wasn't. Something was there, just beyond sight, waiting for him to step outside. He thought about telling his mother, but the sound of his father's voice downstairs kept him frozen. He could hear the words this time. It's almost time. He's the firstborn. There's no other way. The night it happened, the air felt heavy enough to press on your chest. The sky was clouded over, swallowing the moon, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in shadows so deep they seemed to move on their own. The wind cut through the tall grass, whispering against the walls like something alive. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet, each creak of the wooden floor sounding S. Harper, closer. The boy lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the dark ceiling. He could hear the faint hum of the fridge downstairs, the slow ticking of the hallway clock, and somewhere beneath it all, the low voice that had been visiting him for weeks. It was closer tonight, curling around his thoughts like smoke. It's time, it whispered. Come to the door. His chest tightened. His hands felt cold even under the blanket. Downstairs, his father sat at the kitchen table, a single lamp casting a yellow pool of light around him. There was an empty glass in front of him and the faint smell of whiskey in the air. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, his jaw tight, as if he'd been sitting there for hours waiting for something, someone. The mother was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands clasped together, so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She didn't look at him when he passed through. She didn't say a word. The boy came down slowly, his bare feet silent on the stairs. His father didn't speak, just nodded toward the back door. The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother. She still wouldn't meet his eyes. He wanted her to say something, anything, but she stayed still, staring at the floor. The wind outside slapped against the house as his father unlocked the back door. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something metallic, faint but sharp. The boy's heart pounded so hard it made his ears ring. He stepped out into the darkness, his father following close behind. They walked toward the edge of the yard, where the tall grass bent low and the fence sagged from years of neglect. The shadows there seemed thicker, heavier. The boy could feel something waiting beyond them, though he couldn't see it. The voice in his head grew louder, no longer whispering but calling, insistent. Firstborn, come forward. The mother stood in the doorway now, her hands gripping the frame. She wanted to call out, to stop whatever was about to happen, but fear held her still. She told herself she couldn't move because the younger children were upstairs sleeping. But deep down, she knew it was something else, something she'd been avoiding for years. The far edge of the yard, the father stopped. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "It has to be this way," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. The boy's legs felt like they might give out. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to know he wasn't coming back from here. The figure emerged from the darkness. Not entirely human, its outline shifting in the dim light. Its eyes were deep and black, pulling at the boy's gaze until he couldn't look away. The air around it felt wrong, like it was sucking the warmth out of the world. The father put a hand on the boy's shoulder, firm and unshakable. "It's for all of us," he said. "Don't fight." But the boy did. Instinct took over, and he twisted out of his father's grip, stumbling backward. The figure moved faster than seemed possible, closing the distance in an instant. Cold hands, if they could be called hands, wrapped around him, pulling him in. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. The mother's voice finally broke through. "Stop!" she screamed, stepping into the yard. She ran toward them, her bare feet sinking into the wet grass. For a moment, the figure paused, tilting its head toward her, as if curious. That hesitation gave the boy a second, just one, but it wasn't enough. The thing's grip tightened, and his body went rigid, his breath freezing in his throat. The father grabbed his wife, holding her back. She fought against him, clawing at his arms, screaming his name. "Let him go, please." But he held her firm, his face set in stone. Tears streamed down her cheeks, blurring her vision, but she could still see her son's wide, terrified eyes as the darkness swallowed him whole. And then he was gone. The yard was empty except for the three of them, the grass bending gently as if something had passed through. The mother collapsed to her knees, the wet earth soaking her nightgown. Her sobs shook her entire body. The father stood over her, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind died down, leaving only the sound of the clock ticking faintly inside the house. Finally, the father crouched beside her, his voice low. "It's done," he said. "We're safe now." But the mother knew better. She knew there was no safety in this. The thing had taken what it wanted, and debts like this were never paid, just once. Inside the house, the silence felt wrong, thicker, heavier than before. The younger children slept upstairs, unaware that their brother was gone. The mother wiped her face with trembling hands, then stood and walked back inside without looking at her husband. She closed the door and locked it, though she knew it wouldn't keep anything out. The father stayed outside for a while longer, staring into the darkness where the figure had vanished. There was no relief in his face, only the weight of what he'd done. When he finally came back inside, he didn't speak. He poured himself another drink, his hands steady, and sat at the table until the first light of dawn crept through the windows that morning. The official story would be that the boy had gone missing in the night. People would search the fields, the woods, and the nearby river. They would hang his picture in the post office, light candles in the church, whisper prayers over dinner tables. But the truth, what happened, would never be spoken aloud, because the ones who knew understood something terrible. The prophecy hadn't ended that night. It had only begun. The morning after, the house felt hollow, as if something essential had been ripped out and left a vacuum in its place. The mother moved through the kitchen in silence, her hands working on automatic, coffee, toast, dishes, while her mind drifted somewhere far away. Every sound seemed too loud. The clink of a spoon against a cup, the creak of the floorboards under her feet. Upstairs, the younger children asked where their brother was. She told them he must have gone outside early, her voice calm enough to fool them, but not herself. The father left before sunrise, claiming he was going to look. He didn't say where. When he returned hours later, there was no dirt on his boots, no sweat on his brow. He didn't speak of what he'd found, or hadn't. He just sat at the hen table, flipping through the newspaper as if it were any other morning. The mother didn't ask. She was afraid of the answer. By noon, the boy's absence was noticed. A neighbor came by, knocking hard on the door, concern etched into her face. "Have you seen him?" she asked. "He wasn't in school today." The mother forced a worried look and shook her head. Within an hour, calls were being made. By evening, the sheriff's truck was in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the gloom. The official story was set quickly. The boy had gone out after dark and hadn't returned. Search parties formed. Flashlights bobbed through the fields. Voices called his name into the wind. The mother walked with him at first, her steps mechanical, her eyes scanning the ground without hope. The father joined too, but his manner was different, methodical, detached, as though he were following a script. Within days, his picture was everywhere, in shop windows, on telephone poles, taped to the bulletin board in the church vestibule. People who'd known him his whole life spoke about him in soft voices, as though he'd already crossed into memory. They talked about his smile, his politeness, and his kindness. They did not talk about the tension in his house, or the way his father's shadow seemed to stretch over him like a cage. The community's sympathy was real, but so were the whispers. Some thought the father knew more than he said. Others wondered about the mother's quietness, how she never seemed to cry in public. The family's once solid reputation, built on the father's influence and the illusion of stability, began to crack. Old grievances resurfaced. People remembered debts unpaid, favors taken but never returned. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew unbearable. The younger children were restless, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand it. The mother found herself staring at their faces, wondering which one of them would be next if the prophecy still lingered. Sleep came rarely. When it did, it brought dreams she couldn't escape. Her eldest son's voice calling to her from somewhere she couldn't reach. The father, on the surface, was unchanged. He went to work, attended community meetings, and even shook hands at the grocery store. But at night, when the house was dark, the mask slipped. He would pour drink after drink, sitting in the same chair at the kitchen table, staring out the window toward the field where the boy had vanished. Sometimes he muttered to himself, words the mother couldn't catch, but that made her skin crawl. There was no arrest, no charges, nothing to link them to a crime no one could define. The sheriff, after weeks of searching, scaled back the effort. These things happen, he told the mother one afternoon, his tone heavy with resigna. Tyin', sometimes kids wander too far. Sometimes they don't come back. She nodded, but inside, the words felt like a verdict. The newspapers lost interest after a month. The posters in shop windows faded in the sun, their corners curling. The boy's name was mentioned less often, until it was only brought up in quiet conversations, accompanied by a shake of the head and a sigh. The town moved on. The family could not. Guilt settled into the mother like a sickness. She replayed that night over and over, wondering if there was a moment, just one, where she could have stopped it. She thought of the small box she'd hidden in her apron pocket weeks earlier, the one she never opened. She thought of running, of taking the children and leaving, but she hadn't, and now one of them was gone. The father's justification became a shield. It had to be done, he told her once, his voice steady. You don't understand what would have happened if we hadn't. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him she didn't care about debts or promises or prophecies. But the words never came. Part of her feared him too much. Part of her feared the truth even more. In the quiet hours before dawn, she sometimes thought she heard footsteps in the hallway. Light, hesitant, like a child trying not to wake anyone. Once, she swore she saw the faint outline of her son standing in the doorway to her bedroom. But when she blinked, he was gone. She didn't tell her husband. She didn't want to give him a reason to say it was all in her head. The prophecy hung over her like a shadow she couldn't step out of. She didn't know when it would call again or which child it would take. But she knew this. When it did, the father would answer. And she wasn't sure if she had the strength to stop him. Years passed, but time didn't heal the wound. It only pushed it deeper, where it festered quietly. The boy's disappearance never faded entirely from the town's memory, but it became one of those stories people only spoke of in hushed tones, usually late at night. A cautionary tale for children, a source of quiet suspicion for adults. His face, frozen forever in a school photograph, still looked out from the corner of the church bulletin board, the colors faded, the edges curling. The mother carried her grief like an extra limb, always there, always heavy. She learned to function with it, to smile at the grocery clerk to answer the neighbors politely, to attend school events for her other children. But there was never a moment when she didn't feel the absence beside her, the missing place at the table, the sound she didn't hear when the others laughed. She avoided mirrors at night, afraid she'd catch a glimpse of him behind her. Her relationship with her husband became something cold and mechanical. They spoke only when necessary, never about that night. She stopped asking questions. She had learned that answers were more dangerous than silence. She knew he still believed what he'd done was necessary. She also knew he'd do it again if the prophecy demanded that knowledge was worse than any threat he could make. Legally, nothing had ever touched them. There was no evidence, no body, no proof of a crime. Without those things, the law could only wait. The sheriff eventually retired, and his replacement had no interest in reopening old wounds. The case file sat in a drawer, gathering dust. In the eyes of the law, the boy was simply another missing child. But in the eyes of the community, there was always something unspoken hanging over the family, a quiet mistrust that never quite went away. The younger children grew up under that shadow. They were treated differently by their peers, not cruelly, but with a kind of guarded curiosity. People watched them closely, as though expecting them to carry the same fate. The mother tried to protect them from it, but there were things she couldn't shield them from. They had heard the whispers. They had seen the way their father's face hardened when certain topics came up. The prophecy itself, if you could call it that, remained an unspoken thread woven through their lives. The mother didn't know if it was real in the way her husband believed, or if it was just an excuse for something darker inside him. Either way, the effect was the same. It had taken her son, and it had left a mark that would never fade. Looking at the broader picture, the town's reaction said as much about human nature as it did about the crime itself. At first, there had been outrage, prayers, and candlelight vigils. But as time passed, and no resolution came, people turned inward, choosing comfort over confrontation. It was easier to believe the boy had simply wandered off than to consider the possibility that something darker and closer had claimed him. That willingness to look away was part of what allowed the truth to stay buried. People didn't want to think about what might happen behind closed doors, especially in a place where everyone knew each other. To admit that such a thing could happen here was to admit they were never as safe as they thought. And safety, even if it's only an illusion, is something people will fight to protect. The story of the boy's disappearance became a quiet warning about power, the kind that doesn't shout but whispers, the kind that hides in plain sight. His father had the kind of influence that made people hesitate before asking hard questions. His confidence, his position in the community, his ability to make problems disappear, all of it had insulated him from suspicion. And in a place like this, where reputation carried more weight than truth, that was often enough. Morally, the lines blurred in ways that were hard to untangle. Was the father acting out of fear for his family, or out of loyalty to something older and more sinister? Was the mother guilty for not stopping him, or was she simply another victim, trapped by the same fork? That took her son? These questions lingered without answers, a reminder that morality is rarely as clear as we want it to be. Years later, when the mother was older and the younger children had left the house, she would sometimes walk to the edge of the yard at night, standing where it had happened. She would close her eyes and listen, not for the wind, not for the distant hum of the town, but for the faintest sound of footsteps. She imagined she could still feel the air change in that spot, still hear the voice that had called her son away, in the end, there was no justice in the legal sense. The world didn't balance itself. The guilty were never punished. The innocent were never returned. The story faded, but it never ended. It became a part of the town's fabric, woven into the spaces between conversations, into the glances people exchanged when the family's name was mentioned. For the mother, the true punishment was living with the knowledge, not just of what had been done, but of what she hadn't done to stop it. For the father, if there was guilt, he never showed it. Perhaps that was his power, the ability to live with the weight of his choices without ever letting them crush him. And for the town, the legacy of the boy's disappearance was a lesson most weren't ready to learn. That evil doesn't always come from strangers. And sometimes the most dangerous promises are the ones made in the dark between people you trust.